two of the most successful examples of news-driven podcasting, the New York Times and Vox. Please welcome Jimmy Saunders and Lillian Shu. Jimmy, by the way, is the Executive Director of Audio and Events at New York Times. He's led the audio business since 2020, but before that was at the famous New York Times T Studio, and before that at Sharethrough. Lillian is Executive Director of Audio Business at Vox. She was previously, as many podcasters are, from the public radio sector. She was at New York Public Radio, where she oversaw shows like New Yorker Radio Hour and Radio Lab. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So I'd like to start by just talking about your portfolios, because they're different portfolios, and I want to talk about the business cases behind them. So and also tell us some of the shows that we may or may not be familiar with. But tell us about what you've learned about right-sizing your portfolio, why this size of portfolio is appropriate for your particular business model. Go ahead, Jim.
Okay, I'll start. Thanks again for having me here. But New York Times is pretty unique. We are not your traditional audio publisher. We currently have a total of 9 active shows, which is probably significantly less than most you'd hear from most publishers. Mm-hmm. We had the advantage of launching with a show that was wildly successful, like beyond anything we expected. When we launched the Daily in 2017, we expected like a couple 100,000 downloads in the first few months, and it got 42 million. Like, oops, this is great. But that gave us a foundation to build off of, and so we didn't have to scramble, and we didn't have to try to create content. We had the base audience, and we were able to build from there. So we were able to purchase Serial, so we have kind of 2 of the biggest inflection moments in podcasting history under our belt, Serial and then the Daily, which brought news to market. And so we created shows like Hard Fork in technology. Mostly it is a look behind the scenes at the journalists who put out the news that our users are already interested in, just in a different format. And so again, there wasn't a mad dash to create as much content as we could. It was what makes sense. You look at shows like Modern Love, that had been an existing franchise for decades. It made sense to have an audio. It was even an Amazon show for a little bit. You look at Ezra Klein, a journalist in his own right, also has his own audio show. So that's kind of our lane. That's where we sit.
But you see a deep connection between the content and the shape of content. You just mentioned that it's very reporting based, your content, and that has something to do with the limits of the portfolio, how big you want to make it or can make it. It's not just a few people chatting.
Correct. The journalism is the basis of everything we do in audio, and that exists outside of audio.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the business, but by the way, you've also got New York Times is famously now going off into gaming. It's got sports sectors. So what is the
cooking?
Pressure?
A few of the
cooking.
Things you actually mentioned in the
What
intro.
is the pressure there for the podcast to follow along and to expand the portfolio into that?
I wouldn't say we think about audio so responsively to the other areas and where we're expanding. Like, we're not going to force a cooking show. If a cooking show doesn't make sense, we're not going to do it. If Sam Sifton decides that like one of the ways that we can reach new audiences or engage our audiences more deeply is through audio, then we'll bring that to the cooking platform as well. But I believe those things can exist separately.
Your podcast portfolio does not need to reflect the full breadth of New York Times. You've decided. Okay.
And I don't think it ever could. I mean, the breadth of the New York Times is massive. We publish a Harry Potter series every single week.
Mm-hmm. Lillian, let's compare and contrast, because you've got, I believe your portfolio is 3 times the size of Jimmy's.
Yeah, so Vox Media is a top 10 podcast publisher, but I think we think less about the specific number of shows in our portfolio and more about having that most influential show across every consumer passion point, whether that's tech and business, news and politics, culture, sports, you name it. And so as a result, we're curating a portfolio that features influential voices and shows that have influence with authority is what we like to call it, and have a unique perspective to offer. We're looking for shows both within our amazing editorial brand, so we have several homegrown shows, Today Explained from Vox.com is our daily news show. We have Pivot with Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway, that's from New York Magazine, and Decoder with Nilay Patel, which came from The Verge, and those are a few examples of those homegrown editorial shows. But I think unlike with the Times, we're also looking to complement that with strategic partnerships with independent creators that we feel like fits that bill of influence with authority. So some examples of those recent partnerships, Esther Perel, esteemed psychotherapist, and her incredible relationships podcast, Where Should We Begin? We just partnered with Andre Iguodala and Evan Turner, NBA stars, with their Point Forward podcast, basketball podcast that talks about basketball, business, and everything in between. Marquez Brownlee, tech YouTuber, who also has this great review podcast, Waveform. And just last week on Valentine's Day, we launched or announced our latest partnership with Brené Brown, who is best-selling author, Power of Vulnerability, and she has 2 great podcasts, Dare to Lead and Unlocking Us, which are dropping new episodes next week. You guys should listen.
Well, let's tie the business models to the portfolios. And whether is 10 as many as you want, is 30 as many as you want? Tell us, and do you want more owned and operated, or do you want more partnerships? I'm curious about how this ties to the revenue piece and the business models. Go.
Okay.
Go ahead, Jimmy.
We'll
We'll go around.
Much like what Lillian said, like, I don't think we're looking for a number. There's not a magic number of like, hey, we need 20 shows, we need 30 shows. It is much more like what is right for our audience and where does an audio show make sense. I sit in a weird position in between like the product and the newsroom and sales. So I would love to have 100 shows that we could be out in market touting about at all times, right? But that, like, the reality of our business is we focus on the quality of the journalism, and where that makes sense to put it into audio format, we're gonna do that. Where it doesn't make sense, we're not. And it's a very kind of thoughtful process, and it's also a lot of work. Right, like 65 hours of work go into your 1 hour episode of the daily, or not even 1 hour, like 30 to 40 minute episode of the daily that you hear. That's 32 people in 65 hours of work for one episode. So when you produce kind of quality audio products, it takes a lot. It takes a lot of resources.
Okay, well, what's the business case for that? I mean, do you need scale? Isn't there any pressure for scale, and maybe do that through more shows? What are the key revenue drivers that are behind all of this, and how does that influence your sense of how big a portfolio you need?
I think there's 2 ways for us. One is, are we going to increase people into the overall ecosystem of the New York Times? And if we are we ultimately going to be able to convert them to a subscription? And 2 is just, to your point, the scale, the sheer volume. Are we going to be able to create enough ad dollars that offset and create a revenue stream that's going to be higher than what it costs us to put these shows out? And it does. And when you have that scale, that helps create that case for...
Well, what are those key revenue streams? What are the key revenue drivers for your portfolio right now?
Meaning...
What are the key revenue sources for the podcast business?
For us, the podcast business is...
Is it straight ad reads? Is it custom podcasting?
Got the question. Okay, it is a mix of all of the above. So the one thing we don't do are host reads, but we focus on audio very similar to how we think about our entire portfolio, which is creating a white space for a brand to be able to tell their story, as opposed to kind of littering and cluttering with ads. And so we don't stack ads. If you use our app, or if you visit us in the mobile web, you'll notice there is a clean experience. It is content. There is white space where there is an ad. There's never more than one of them. Then there's content, and then there might be another space for an ad. And we think the audio should be treated the same. And so there are unstacked ad breaks. At most, we have 3 in the daily and a post roll. So we don't want to be overly interrupted. But what we want to do is we want to allow brands to be able to utilize the platform to be able to tell their story and break through clutter. And we don't believe it's possible to do that when you have 3, 4, 5, 6 ads at a time. That doesn't mean that model doesn't work for others, but with the New York Times, that's
And in your case, are most of your advertisers working through you on the creative? Are they dropping their own creative in there, or are they really doing it? They working with your own team as part of the sell is the service side, is that you're helping develop their ad content?
Yeah, it varies. So when we look at like the traditional audio advertisers, they have their own stuff. They know what they want to do, and either they give us their scripts and we have our voice actors read them, or we can kind of guide them, like, here's the type of script you're going to want to use with the New York Times. We're a little differentiated from some of the competitors out there, so you do a lot of creative consulting. With brands that are new to audio, which is a huge focus, like if you listen to The Daily, you're going to hear a lot of advertisers you don't necessarily hear on other shows, and those are the brand advertisers that we carry over from print or from digital. They need a little bit more hand-holding guidance as to what to do creatively and what their voice sounds like, and we'll use T-Brand Studio, our branded content arm, to help them find that voice.
Now, Lillian's, yours is different. I mean, you've got host reads, you've got programmatic in there, which you don't have. You don't have.
We have programmatic.
Oh, you have some programmatic.
Yes.
Where?
Through
You have some programmatic drops and inserts into your podcast?
We do through
Okay.
AdsWiz, yes.
All right. Tell us about your revenue mix and where it's growing and where you're looking for growth.
Yeah, so our business is kind of built on the strength of our shows and our talent, and we offer brands direct access to really highly engaged audiences, I think just as the Times does, who have a lot of deep trust with their favorite shows and their favorite hosts. Our shows are primarily free and ad-supported. We do have a few subscriptions for certain shows, but primarily we are an advertising-driven business, and that also plugs into the broader advertising ecosystem at Vox Media. So we're seeing a lot of success with what we're calling these multi-platform campaigns and broader partnerships that extend beyond the podcast and can be across live, video, bundling all of that together. And for people who are newer to audio, that's a really good entry point just to bundle everything together. One example of this coming up is our upcoming partnership with Atlassian in March at South by Southwest. So Vox Media is the official podcast partner for South by Southwest. We're programming a 3-day stage. If you're in Austin, please come by. And it will feature a lot of our incredible shows. So Atlassian, in that partnership, they are partnering to sponsor the stage. They are sponsoring a live recording of one of our podcasts at their headquarters. And then they're also sponsoring all of those recordings that are dropped into the various show feeds that, you know, have millions of downloads and reach. And that's just one way that we're working with brands to not only reach, in this case, business decision makers in real life, but also, you know, through the extension of our various show feeds.
Is it fair to say that extensions is one of the places where you see the greatest growth possibilities for podcasting, is to actually move outside the podcast itself?
Yeah, exactly. I think this is a similarity with the Times. We are multi-platform media companies. We are not just audio companies, right? We have the internal infrastructure and the internal muscle to support in video, live. You know, we also have that existing reach, and I think that makes us an appealing place for people to invest and partner with, because we're ultimately trying to create these multi-platform franchises around our shows that can extend beyond the RSS feed, which is really just one way to monetize a show.
Is there a problem here, though, that we're watching podcasting starting to peak as both a business and as a habit? I mean, just there are some overarching market statistics. You know, ad growth is not as expected in the last year. New shows really have flattened quite a bit. We're obviously seeing very public instances of previous investment in podcasting, especially original content, pulling out. You know, exclusive podcasts suddenly being let free to the universe. So are we seeing podcast as a form and as a business actually maybe hitting a peak, and we need to look for these kinds of extension strategies?
I mean,
Go
I'll
ahead.
start.
Go
Well,
ahead.
we are very bullish on podcasting at Vox Media. We, you know, see this in the stats where Edison Research cites over the last 2 years, weekly podcast listeners have grown 20%, and that number has grown 80% over the last 5 years. But I think just taking a step back from the numbers, why we're excited is just a macro trend of the definition of a podcast really continuing to grow and expand. I think at the end of the day, a podcast is a digital show, and I think the lines between audio, video, social are continuing to blur. And people, like, through platforms with YouTube, people are watching or listening to a podcast and they don't even realize it's a podcast necessarily. We have shows like Waveform that have hundreds and thousands of millions of views on every single episode, and those people might think they're watching or listening to just a YouTube show, but it's something that we would call a podcast. So with the expansion of the form, I think we're really excited because that just continues to open up a lot of opportunity.
Do you think podcasting has peaked? I mean, it took 20 years to get to this. This is one of the slowest rolls of media that I've seen. And I started back in 2004 proselytizing to everybody, you got to try podcasting, you got to try podcasting. And it really took a while for people to adopt this habit. And as I'm looking at the statistics now, I'm really starting to see that maybe it is not a mass medium. It is a medium where it's going to hit a certain peak. It's a nice niche.
I don't necessarily agree with that. The Daily itself receives as many downloads as there are viewers of the Today Show and Good Morning America. I mean, there's massive scale in audio when it's done right. I think there's a couple different factors going on. I think the pandemic changed behavior a little bit, and then there was a quick overinvestment in a lot of creative that maybe has pulled back a little bit. But I also think there's still, despite the lack of new shows that you mentioned, massive saturation. And so the cream has to rise to the top, where the shows that are going to make sense for people to listen to, they're not going to listen to 20 shows. You don't have the time you did in 2020 to listen to your top 20 shows. That's going to become 10 shows. And so what 10 shows is that going to be? But for brands and publishers like the New York Times who exist outside of audio, there is a large audience who wants to consume that content in audio format. You are going to go to the gym, you're going to walk your dog, you're going to commute, you're going to do those things where you want to learn things in new ways and you want the New York Times perspective. And I definitely think there's room for growth there.
All right, well, let's talk about revenue growth and where you're going to see revenue growth. Now, one of the things that I think, Jimmy, the Times has the advantage of having a lot of legacy brands and blue chip brands that are advertising elsewhere that is bringing into the podcast fold, and using the T Studio is one of the ways to do that. Lillian, you had, I think, the Vox network, probably you have more of a mix of DR, of sort of the original drivers of podcasting, which tended to be DR advertisers, and yet that's a market that's drying up because we all know why. And I'm curious where you are in the transition from DR to brand advertisers, and what have been the most successful ways of grabbing those brand dollars?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. Well, we have the benefit of being part of the broader Vox Media advertising business, so we have a lot of those direct relationships with larger brands that are often first-time audio buyers or buying as part of a multi-platform campaign. I think where we're continuing to see success is great ad creative and partnering with brands that are authentically part of our hosts' everyday lives. So we do host reads, unlike the Times, but we like to go the extra mile, I would say, for our partners. And one concrete example of this is if any of you have listened to any of Kara Swisher's podcasts, whether that's On with Kara Swisher or Pivot, you will know that she's a passionate fan of her Chevy Bolt EV. She loves talking about it all the time. So we partnered with Chevy and we sent Vox Creative, which is our brand studio, in the car with Kara on the road to record that host read. You can hear her kind of making fun of people waiting in line for gas. The ad creative is really fun, and I think, actually I think MediaPost might have covered that ad. And that ad creative is not only super engaging to a listener, like that's not something I'm gonna fast forward through because it's Kara having fun in her car as part of her everyday life, but it's also something that our brand partners really appreciate because we are really thinking about creative ways to super serve them and deliver a great experience for both the listener and our advertising partner.
Beyond revenue, both of you are using podcasts to drive other parts of the business or to drive awareness and people into the other part of the business. In your case, you've got a subscription model. and I'm curious, how are you not just better able to able to optimize your podcast portfolio so that it actually serves that function, because the core revenue at New York Times now is subscription. But how are you measuring it? How are you accountable to the rest of the company in terms of being able to say, this is how we've increased the New York Times business?
So I don't have a very specific answer, because we have a dedicated subs team who's probably looking at that in great detail and has their own metrics. But like anecdotally, audio as a platform has brought in tremendously new, younger audiences for us. And so at the New York Times, we tend to attract, it's kind of like consistent regardless of how you engage with the Times. It is typically an above average household income, above average education, sitting with 2 Ivy Leaguers. It's not easy, by the way. And then also above average in job title. Mm-hmm. So that has stayed consistent in our audio platform as well, but it's gotten considerably younger. Mm-hmm. So when you look at the types of subscribers we have and who's going to engage with our cooking and games products, it is younger audiences, right? Wordle is a fad. It's not a fad, it's a lasting fad. We're up to our 1,000th Wordle in March. Younger audiences engage with that. And so you can just look at the addition of the subscribers. Or the paying subscribers. We're now up to 10.4 million subscribers. A lot of them are getting younger. Mm-hmm. And I think that's
so you're seeing it. I mean, you can prove it. So you're aiming for a larger demographic, but you can actually see it on the bottom line that your subscriber base is actually getting younger, and it may very well be tied to podcasting.
I would say that there is a team that's dedicated to doing that analysis.
Okay, Lillian, how about you? What's the role of podcasting in deepening relationships and widening relationships with your audience base, and are you able to measure that impact?
Yeah, I would slightly widen the aperture of that, because I feel like it is truly a symbiotic relationship between our podcasting business and the wider Vox Media ecosystem. So on the one hand, because I mentioned this before, because we are both multimedia, multi-platform companies, that infrastructure is extremely valuable to growing our podcasting business and growing the individual shows beyond the RSS feed, bringing live experiences, bringing video, you name it, and that allows us to truly create these multi-platform franchises. But on the other hand, podcasting, brings immense value to Vox Media. I think there's probably 3 areas. One is on the business side, just being a cornerstone of a lot of these really large multi-platform campaigns like South by Southwest and Atlassian, and that's very measurable just simply by looking at the ad dollars. The second is it does help us promote other parts of our business, our subscription business for New York Magazine, for example. We had this great partnership with Esther Perel. One of her episodes is a call-in episode where people are calling Esther for their various relationship troubles, and we publish that as a bi-weekly column in The Cut. And that is something that we've seen to be a very effective driver of subscription to New York Magazine, and something that our dedicated subscription team is really excited about, because our podcast is creating new content for the site that is actually driving new incremental subscribers. And then I think the third area is just, it's a great way to bring in amazing talent into our ecosystem. So through these shows that people are making and are very passionate about, and because we are partnering with them, they're joining the Vox Media ecosystem. We can plug them into other parts of our business, like our Code conference every year, and feature them as speakers or as part of South by Southwest. So I think that's a qualitative area, and obviously it does contribute to our bottom line, but it's just a great way to bring in amazing talent into our company.
I want to come at one of the topics that has always been one of the major challenges of podcasts as a business, but also as a listening experience, which is discoverability. Famously, the Apple podcast platform sucked. I mean, I started by mentioning that Apple is a tech company and became a media company. It doesn't mean it's a really good media company. And podcasting is one of the best examples of that. But then, of course, we've also seen much broader distribution possibilities. But still, discoverability, and Jimmy, as you said, we are so cluttered in the podcast space already, because the bars against entry are so low. What have you guys discovered about what works best in terms of getting people to discover and bringing in new audiences? What's working?
I would say, again, I'll go back to I think the point I first made. We were somewhat lucky to stumble upon the success with the daily because that gave us a foundation to build on. What we find with our portfolio is the best way to generate excitement about new shows is through podcasts, and that can take a couple different shapes. One is endorsements, so that's one place we will do endorsements. We'll endorse our own shows, and so having Michael Barbaro shout out about a new show. We have a new one, The Interview, launching with Lulu Navarro-Garcia in April.
I love that show. I heard an early.
It's going to be really cool. A culture show. It sounds fun. But whether we drop something in the feed, so if you have a really interesting episode of Ezra Klein or of Modern Love that we want people to listen to or pay attention to, we can drop it into the daily. Or if it's narrative storytelling, we can drop it into the feed of the Serial, which again is massive, like hundreds of millions of downloads every time you launch something with Serial. And so you can take advantage of those audiences, and you have listeners, and that is the quickest way to grow an audio audience.
Are there any diminishing returns there? I mean, has it remained effective, that of dropping in episodes or having refers? Because as a listener, I'll tell you, the tropes of podcasting become old very quickly, and they start to become invisible.
Like all things, I don't think you can overdo it, right? Mm-hmm. If you start putting 4, 5, 6 things a week into the feed of the daily, then all of a sudden they're going to become blind to it, right? Too much is nothing at all. And so if you can every once in a while say, hey, here's something you're going to be interested in, and it's thoughtful, and it comes every now and then, the audience will typically reward you with at least giving it a try.
Lillian, you've got a broader portfolio that you need to get discovered.
Yeah.
Without these massive core drivers, I mean, you have some really massive ones.
Yeah, don't discount our. We have our own. Massive
You have your
drivers.
own massive ones. But what have you learned, and what has changed and evolved on the discoverability challenge?
Yeah, I will echo everything Jimmy has just said. I think cross-promotion within the network continues to be very successful for us. We don't really observe any diminishing returns, as you mentioned, and I think the benefit of both of our networks being so curated and thoughtful is that people do have trust in our recommendations and the host recommendations, so that continues to be an area we will push in, whether that's promos or feed drops. There are 2 other areas that we are excited about and have been spending time on. One of them is creative editorial collaborations. So we have a very wide-ranging portfolio, but all of our hosts and teams, we try to get them to meet each other and get to know each other so that they can have these organic editorial collaborations. And I'll give you one concrete example. Pivot has a segment on its show called Friends of Pivot, and it often features a lot of our hosts. Esther Perel goes on Pivot often, so much that Kara has deemed her as a best friend of Pivot. And one thing that came out of that is the crossover episode that just dropped in both feeds earlier this week, where Scott and Kara go into Dr. Perel's proverbial office, and they have a couples therapy session, a professional couples therapy session where they're reflecting on their relationship and why it works and why so many of us love listening to them banter, argue, hug it out, And that episode drops in both feeds. It's a true organic episode, and it exposes both audiences to new talent in a very natural way, so it doesn't feel forced or uncomfortable. So those episodes and those crossover moments are measurably very effective in bringing in new audience.
Yeah, Jimmy,
that episode was fascinating, by the way. I listened to it on the way here.
Good.
Jimmy, you guys took what struck me when I saw it as quite a flyer with the New York Times. You took podcasting, which is one discoverability problem. You doubled down by having a dedicated app, which is another discovery problem. And you decided to combine these 2 challenges in a dedicated audio New York Times app. What the hell?
We don't like to make things easy. It's, complicate them whenever we can. So we've talked about it. We are a subscription-first company, and we want to deliver content how our users want to engage with it. And the app that we created creates a curated experience for those who want to engage with us that way. And if you think about how we've gone to market with the other products that you mentioned, games as an example, any Wordle or Connections players here?
Larry David, I don't know if anyone's watched Curb. Wordle is a huge feature in the new season.
Love that. So if you want to engage with it, you could do so through the mobile web. You could do that through our core app. And if you want a curated gaming experience where you have all of it in one place and in a bigger way, then you could download the Games app and you could just do games all day if you wanted to, and archived crosswords. And audio is kind of the same way. If you just want to listen to the daily, you probably don't need the app. But if you want the daily hard fork reporter reads, we have custom show the headlines there, which in my opinion, draws on the success of the daily, which it gives you the behind the scene from the reporter's perspective of what to pay attention to that day. You have to go to the app. We have reads from articles and audio writer read reports. We bring in content and do reads from the New Yorker and Vanity Fair and an area
New York
called the
Magazine.
Magazine Stand.
How's it doing?
It's great.
Well,
great.
how's it performing? Come on. Give us
It's performing well. I'm never going to give subscriber data out, but we wouldn't continue with it if it wasn't doing well, right? It's a way to keep our subscribers in our ecosystem. It's a way to give them what they want, which is a way to receive our content in a unique format.
I'm going to go to questions in a second, but we definitely need to talk about the ad question. One of the long-standing problems in podcasting has been ad performance, how to measure it, how to convince advertisers that this stuff actually works. And of course, again, thanks to our friends at Apple, the initial measurement for podcasting was really awful.
Non-existent.
How are you making the case? How are you measuring ad performance now? What are you doing internally? What are the metrics that matter to advertisers and that are convincing to them?
I feel like due to proximity, I get to answer every question first, which isn't really fair.
Go ahead,
You
Lillian. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Lillian.
I'll go, and please, Jimmy, join in. But I would first like to say that all of the metrics that advertisers care about, conversion, brand lift, that's available in podcasting nowadays. We're not at a disadvantage there. And we work with a lot of, like other podcast publishers, a lot of third-party partners who are measuring things like conversion. And we'll also sometimes couple that with brand studies to just measure sentiment and general lift and change there. There are some DR advertisers or certain companies that care a lot more about custom URLs or promotional codes. So we really kind of cater to what specific brand partners care about, but people actually are very happy about the measurement that they can have, and we're finding in video, because that sometimes isn't as easily measured, that people are greedy with all of the metrics available in podcasts, and so I feel like there's a lot there. Jimmy, I'm curious kind of what your take is.
Yeah, I kind of agree completely. I switched from, I've been at the New York Times for almost a decade, but I've been involved with the podcast since 2020. And in 2020, I was like, what the hell? Like, here's how many downloads there are. And that's about all you could give, because that's all Apple gave you. But everything has really changed since then. And we work with partners like Veritonic, because they can help measure things across the board. If the brands want attribution, we can give them attribution. If they want brand studies, cross-media studies, if we want to find out which creative is going to be more effective to a New York Times audience, we can figure that out before it ever goes live. And so I think the last 4 years have been pivotal in being able to show the results. And I'll also give a nod just to the platform in general. Audio works really well and better than anything else we've seen. When we do brand studies, cross-media studies, it is off the charts when you look at audio. My theory is you're not doing anything else when you're listening to podcasts that involves other media. So you have near 100% share of attention. You might be walking your dog, as I mentioned before, or exercising or doing something physical, but you're typically not watching TV while you're listening to a podcast or doing something else that takes away from your kind of ability to pay attention to the content. And it really works, all the brand studies we do.
Lillian, are there particular brand metrics that advertisers are coming to podcasts for?
I think it's just about measuring campaign effectiveness and I think I can't speak to specific metrics. I'm not on the ad sales team, so I have to defer to my colleagues there. But we do see people just coming back again and again because of how effective the attribution is, just through pixel tracking and everything. You can see that people are going to the website and taking those calls to action from the audio ads.
I want to
and top funnel as well. Just sorry to add that top funnel metrics also, when you look at like consideration and awareness metrics, are off the chart. Specifically consideration.
We have time for questions. Joe?
We're at time, but let's do it.
Okay, Joe's, I'm sorry. Well,
Joe
We'll be all right.
Mandisi, MediaPost. Oh, by the way, I should do a plug. Steve has a really excellent podcast about the Brand Insider on Spotify. You should all check it out.
Is it only on Spotify, Steve? You should be everywhere.
no, it's everywhere. It's everywhere.
Oh, I'm sorry. You can syndicate them.
Yeah, we have to talk about distribution channel.
Right, that's right.
But it's something I've thought about, and I wanted to ask you guys, because it's incremental to what we do. What I heard from both of you is that it's been incremental. It's been incremental content, advertising revenue, and audience. My question is, how has it impacted your organizations, the culture of your publishing companies, and how do you think it will change it going forward? I remember when you used to be all the news fit for print, and there's many extensions of the New York Times and Vox, but what I'm asking you is the bigger question. Is it changing the way your organizations think of themselves as publishers?
I wouldn't say it fundamentally changes how we think about ourselves as publishers. I mean, at the root of everything we do is and will always be the journalism that's going to serve its purpose. And audio serves as a way to distribute that content to a wider audience in a different and unique way that we hadn't been able to do before, and gave us access to new audiences. What I can tell you anecdotally, and from what we hear when the Daily first launched, it was really hard to get the attention of the reporters and to say, hey, I don't have like an hour to sit with you to be on this show. And now there's probably a line like around the block of the New York Times trying to be the story of the day on the Daily. And so I think it's caught the attention of the people at the New York Times, but I don't think it's fundamentally shifted who we are, which is always going to be journalism first.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think it's really a way to augment the ethos of Vox Media and what we care about. I think another interesting aspect just with podcasting is I think it's been an effective way to bring together a very large company and a lot of different sets of talent, because there are these organic ways to, whether it's appearing on a show, having our reporters come on Today Explained, or having our various hosts come on other shows. It's created some cultural connectivity across a very large umbrella organization, and I think that is why everyone, whether it's talent or teams, are pretty excited when they get close to a podcast or are able to partner with a podcast.
Yeah, I think it's shining a light on a lot of the journalists and the participants who might have been like experts in their own right beforehand, but didn't necessarily have like a light
wide
shining
audience,
on them.
yes.
And a wide, yes.
One quick exit question before we wrap. What do you guys know now about making podcasting a viable business for a publisher that maybe you didn't know 2 years ago?
Well, I don't, even from based on what you said with the names you gave, up and including Brene Brown, I think it's really important to have a niche and a brand outside of audio to be wildly successful in audio. And if you look at the best podcasts out there and the most successful podcasts out there, the majority of them, not all of them, you still have your crime junkies and some others, but the majority of them like had something established beforehand, and they could bring a certain value where audio becomes a different distribution mechanism as opposed to the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of...
That might include celebrity as that external thing, because that's
100%.
one of the things that's driving it now, smart lists.
Yeah, I mean, the Kelsey brothers aren't podcasters, right? They're football players who have a successful podcast.
Right. Lillian, how about you?
Yeah, I would say I think being where the target audience is matters. And I think I'll go back to what I said earlier, that podcasting isn't necessarily just audio anymore. And so you have to meet people where they are. And whether that's on YouTube with Waveform or Point Forward. I think a lot of tech and sports fans and audiences are accessing podcasts through video, but we're not just fixated on video for video's sake. We're thinking bespoke, like what makes sense for every brand. Both us and the Times, we have some of our shows on public radio. So we have Today Explained, we know that a lot of their target audience is public radio listeners. So they actually reach over 1 million listeners on the public radio airwaves in addition to their podcast audience. And so we're not just thinking about the next era of medium, but really what distribution channel makes the most sense for the target audience we're trying to capture, and how do we make sure that we're showing up there? And that's really important, I think, to continue growing the business.
Lillian, Jimmy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.